Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Plymouth University, welcome to the Roland Levinsky building, and welcome to this evening's CogTalk, which is on the subject of music. But before I begin, we have two announcements to make. The first announcement concerns the next CogTalk, which will take place on the 30th of March, which is a Wednesday, not our usual Thursday, on a Wednesday. The CogTalk actually starts at 6:15, but there will be an address by the Vice-Chancellor at 6 o'clock, and you're invited to drinks and refreshments at 5:30 if you'd like to come at that particular time. This will take place in the Sherwell reception area of what used to be the Sherwell Church. Do you all know where that is? Okay, it's not, right? What used to be the rather attractive church with the limestone, the pink and grey detailing. If you look at the arches, how beautifully they've been done. So that's where that will take place, in the ground floor of the Sherwell building, what used to be the Sherwell Church. If you can let the reception staff know at the box office if you'll be coming, that would be most helpful so that we can arrange for numbers. If you don't let the reception staff know and you could let us know some other way, that would also be great. So it's not essential that you let people know on the way out. So that's our first announcement, and our second announcement I'm going to ask Simon to give us. Simon.
Thank you. Thanks very much for giving me a few minutes. This talk this evening from Dan and Alexis is very much allied to our Peninsula Arts Contemporary Music Festival, which is run in partnership with the ICCMR. And it happens for the remainder of this weekend, so there are events on Friday, Saturday and Sunday. And in particular, I would mention the Many Worlds event of Alexis, Kirke, and then the Symphony of Minds Listening from Eduardo Miranda. In particular, the Saturday evening event, Dan has contributed with his brain. What you'll probably understand a little bit more about that as he's speaking this evening. I'd also like to thank him for making the animations of the brain images, which will be projected along with the orchestra's performance on Saturday. So thank you very much for doing this. But for the whole programme, I've mentioned the two Saturday events, but the whole programme, there's these two documents here, and you can find out all about it. It's very exciting, very diverse, interesting, challenging, and there's a lot of beautiful music. So do come along. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, now for this evening. I think you're all familiar with music as recreation. Music is something you listen to, it's part of the arts, it's something for fun. But can music actually be a science as well as an art? Can the music provide a language of science for the future? Can we actually talk in music rather than in the kind of words which I'm using at the moment? That's the kind of idea we'll be exploring this evening with our two speakers. We have Dr. Alexis Kirke, who's Permanent Research Fellow at Plymouth University, and Professor Dan Lloyd, who's Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience at Trinity College in Connecticut, USA. So those two speakers are going to help us through this evening. I'm going to start by turning to Alexis. If computers are programmed to have emotions, and we look at the electrical output from those computers, do they actually sound like music? Do emotional computers have music running through their circuitry? That's the question which I'm going to ask Alexis to address first. Alexis.
Thank you, Michael. So, as Michael said, I'm a research fellow here at Plymouth University. I'm a member of Eduardo Miranda's Interdisciplinary Centre for Computer Music Research, and I have a few slides here. I'm just going to do 10 minutes, basically, to give you some background. So I've given this a rather catchy title. I thought it was catchy. Sonatas in the Circuit Board, Computers that Calculate with Music. I'm going to kick off immediately with a couple of pieces of music, just to remind ourselves what music can do to us emotionally. So first, we'll have a piece of Beethoven. we are. Diverse emotions expressed and communicated by music. More on these tracks later on. So, one of the first questions I need to ask to give a background on what I'll be talking about, do we want machines to feel? Do we really care? These are just machines. Do they need to have any sense of emotion? Well, yes we do, because we want machines to serve us, we want machines to be useful to us, and we are full of feelings, and we act on our feelings all the time. So if a machine can understand those feelings, and what better way to understand than to have some emotional processing itself, then it can serve us better. Furthermore, our communication, well, I'll give you an example with that, all right? Take some famous Hollywood actor star, all right? The assistant for that star is going to be much better at, I'm sure you've heard about what these personal assistants are like. They run and get the water, they make sure that the toilet flushes the right type, they make sure that the coffee is exactly right, and the double dip latte with just the right amount of cinnamon. Apparently it's hell being an assistant to a Hollywood star. But the point is, this guy is much more useful because he understands all of the emotional peccadilloes of the star, and one of the reasons is the assistant is a human being, an emotional animal. Now, let's also imagine that the personal assistant is with the Hollywood star, and the Hollywood star is clearly looking extremely unhappy. The tone of his voice, all of the non-verbal signals from his face. Then a successful assistant who wishes to survive in their job will pick up the emotional cues and try and find out what's wrong and try and do what's necessary. A lot of our communication is emotional as well, so if we want machines to be able to communicate better with us, it would be useful if they could understand emotion. And one way of thinking of the importance of emotion is if we consider people with certain affective disorders and how difficult it is for them to function in the world, like autism, for example, because of their lack of emotional communication. Right, so that's one point. The second point I want to make, and this is where Dan and I kind of start to come together in our way of thinking. How similar is thinking and music? So I'm stepping away from the whole issue of emotion for a moment. I'm now looking at how similar is music and thinking. Well, we tend to think of we tend to consider thinking in terms of language, the way I'm speaking now. But if you actually look at the substance of thought, if you actually put an electrode into a brain, and you look at what's happening in that brain at the lowest level, what you actually see are these kind of spikes, these trains of spikes that you can see at the top right-hand corner of the screen. The top left-hand corner, by the way, is a little bit of a neural network. That's what your brain looks like very close up, these neurons. And the information travelling between those neurons looks a lot like what you see at the top right-hand corner, these spikes. Now, there's actually a rhythm there, which I'm going to try and do. Let's see if I can get this right. Oh, I haven't got enough hands now, have I? I'll tell you what. Okay, so it's something like... No pictures. Just to give you... So that's the sort of spiking rhythm. Obviously, you have to multiply that speed by like 1,000 times or something, because you can see at the top right-hand corner, we're talking about 10 milliseconds. Now, if we look below the neural network, we can see a drummer there. Now, the rhythms being output by the drummer at the bottom right-hand corner, these are just rhythms as well. These notes that we can see, which I'll tap out the rhythms for you. There's another rhythm. These can both be thought of in rhythmic terms. But how far can we take this parallel? Can we really have electronic circuit boards which use that same pattern of thinking that we find in the brain? Can we actually have electronic circuit boards where the data running through them is rhythmic or even musical? That's what interests me. That's what I'm interested in, because because music is the language of emotion. Music has been talked of for many centuries as being one of the best ways to purely express emotion, even more so than poetry. And if we can somehow use that to do processing in these computers that have emotions, we may really have something very functional, very useful. Now this gives us other potential advantages. Let me say before I go on to those, music is the language of emotion. I can't just throw that out there. Well, if we think back to that Beethoven, very slow, what's called a minor key, expresses a sort of sadness, a melancholy. We think of Mozart, the notes are much faster, it's a major key, expresses a sort of happy joyousness. These expressions are no coincidence. These features of a major key, a minor key, faster notes, slower notes, have been analysed by music psychologists for a while now. And we understand to a degree which musical features relate to which emotions. So constructing a data stream in computers that contains that computer's emotion, which is also expressed in the music, is not so unfeasible. Other advantages that this could give us is if you put a probe into this circuit board, what you will hear from it is basically, sorry, just a random noise essentially. Now I envision this idea of a music probe, where you have these circuit boards where the circuitry is, there's music running in the veins of the circuitry, and you place a probe in it, it slows it down, and what you hear is what emotion is being processed in that part of the circuit. You get a greater insight into the circuit, for example, when you're building it or if there's problems with it. The other thing is, as Michael said, the output of this circuitry will be much more naturally emotional. It'll come out as music, which expresses the emotion within the circuitry. And furthermore, the input, some of the work that we've done has involved measuring heartbeats and measuring key press rates. Now these are rhythmic, and they immediately go into the realm of music. Sure, there's no melody in them, but they immediately go into the realm of music, and they can be input directly into one of these musical processing machines. So, the technical bit, if that wasn't too technical, we call this pulse melodic affective processing. And essentially, if you look at the data streams in the simulator, at this stage it's simulated circuitry, the happy feelings, when the computer wants to process a happy feeling, we're looking at fast pulses in what's called a major key. When it wants to process, say, a sad feeling, slow pulses in a minor key. So you can compare this to a happy feeling, you'd hear a melody in the circuitry a little like the Marriage of Figaro. A sad feeling, you'd hear a melody in the circuitry a little like the Moonlight Sonata. Experiments. Is this all pie in the sky? Apparently not. Apparently, when I actually run simulations, we get results that make sense. We simulated a 4-robot system, 4 security robots, and we implemented in them a very simple musical processing system. And I won't go into details, but the right-hand side picture is when the security robots, had the processing implemented. It resulted in them searching the area more thoroughly. We also implemented a weapon firing protocol based on the music, where the closer the robot got to an intruder, the faster it fired its weapon. And in fact, at the bottom of the screen, those 3 things that you can see, they're 3 lines of music on the bottom graph there, and they represent the melodies playing in the gun circuitry of the robot. And depending on the speed of those melodies is how fast the robot's firing, and whether the melody is major or minor is whether it's firing or not. One other experiment, because I must have gone over 10 minutes now. Yes, okay, right. I'll finish with this. We've done something with typist emotion detection, I won't go into that. We've also done something with stock market algorithmic trading, where we've looked at converting, analysing what we believe to be the emotional content of the stock market, and inputting that into one of these emotional processing systems. And we've been able to develop a simple very simple algorithmic trading system, which in a simulated market actually made some profits using this system. And I think I really should let Dan get up now. I did have other things to say, but they'll probably emerge during the rest of the conversation, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Thank you very much. Well, computers with feelings. That's amazing, isn't it? When we think of the brain, we often think of the brain as a kind of complex computer. Dan is going to put an alternative view, that we shouldn't think of the brain as a computer, but as an orchestra. So we're now just switching over to Dan's computer, and Dan is going to suggest this alternative view, that we shouldn't think of the brain as a computer, but as a completely different system, the system of an orchestra.
Good afternoon. I'm afraid I'll be doing this one sitting, because otherwise I'd have to run the mouse on my thigh or my stomach or something like that. It would get awkward and distracting. Thank you all very much for coming today. I want to especially thank the organizers of this conference and Eduardo Miranda for inviting me to come here today. I also have to say thank you. I'm the second movement of Symphony of Minds Listening. And I don't know how to put that on my resume, but I am honored and very pleased to have been converted into a piece of music. I think that's a nice destiny for anyone, especially a philosopher. So with that, let me get the screen up. I think we're not on screen now, is that right? Okay. We live in a world of sound, of course, and among sounds which are fascinating in themselves are some sounds which are special, and those sounds we call music. Music then can be represented in lots of ways, including what we see here, just a simple recording of frequencies. But music has the interesting property of being organized sound. Musical traditions organize sound in many different ways, but by virtue of the organization, it's possible to think of music in ways that is more accessible and more analyzable. And that gives us a handle on music that we might not have if we just considered it simply as raw sound. For example, once music has been converted into a score, the sound on the bottom begins to make, there it is. So this is supposed to be, and perhaps it is on screen. All right, I'm going to turn this off and try again. There we go. This is supposed to be sounding. Oh, I see a problem right here. There we go. So now with a score, music becomes organized in a way that we can refer to and look at conceptually. This is a simple visual score, but you can see how the music works. And what we have in located scores is much the same thing. Provide us with a kind of convenient abstraction which is still very close into the sound. So we haven't lost the sound, we have represented the sound in a new way. So for example, we can look at some rather large patches of sound and organize them as visual scores. So this is the soundtrack from an experiment we conducted. This is Eduardo and Zoran Josipovic of NYU University and myself in June. Part of this experiment was listening to Beethoven, and that was the foundation for Eduardo's piece, the Symphony of Minds Listening. Another part involved listening to some other pieces while being in a brain scanner. And so the Bach fugue appears twice in this experiment, followed by a Mozart duet, repeated twice from Cosa fan tutte. This is a piece of Philip Glass, a minimalist piece called One of These Dances. And the last piece is Take the A Train by Duke Ellington. 16 minutes of scanner time to produce brain scans, and here then is what a brain looks like on Duke Ellington. And again, this will probably take a little bit of reorganizing. Once again, I think I have to start over. A couple points I made already by just watching this. The first is that the idea that there's a musical part of the brain is kind of set aside here, because you can see that there's lots of activity throughout the brain when the music is playing. Not only that, though, there's a lot of variability in that activity. I think if you read textbooks or magazines about the brain, it looks like there is a single area that just turns on and then turns off when different tasks are on. In fact, the brain is always in motion. And so there's no one area and there's no one stable condition that the brain is in when it's doing anything, including listening to music. These same areas of the brain that you just saw moving around while the music was playing will continue to move around in the silence and in between. And so it's not like there's any separate part of our lives that is devoted just to the musical part of the brain. So we can go from the idea of raw sound to the organization that is music to the brain. But then the question arises, what about the brain activity itself? And so here the hypothesis that I've been exploring is that that activity itself should be thought of as a form of music. And so that involves asking the question of how would you tell if something you can't actually listen to has anything in common with music? So there is here a scientific question, which I'm going to basically mention without pursuing very far. There are various properties that can be measured of different kinds of signals, including musical scores and examples of language, and those same properties that can then be applied to the brain. I'm not going to say much about these, but I'd be happy to explore them in discussions afterwards. And it turns out that brains are much like music in terms of these properties. And so again, that's the kind of question we ask is what can we measure about music and what can we measure about the brain that we can compare the two of them. And there are some examples of both of those things. But I think, though, the question of music immediately gives rise to the question of sound in a new way. Suppose the organization of the brain is somehow musical. It's a natural artistic impulse to attempt to then render the music of the brain back into audible sound. To my mind, the big question to be pursued here is what sorts of sound are accurate representations of the function of the brain. And this is an ongoing research project of my own. I'm going to play, I think, actually two examples. One is a 2-minute long video in which one form of conversion of brain activity to sound is presented. And it was, it's a freestanding video which has not been published yet. And so it's got a little narration text on the screen, which makes the same points more or less that I've been making in speaking. It's a few minutes long. After that, though, something else has come up in our conversation here just before we started that I think would be also fun for us to pursue for a few minutes as well. In any case, a rendering of brain activity now back into sound to make the point that it isn't just when we hear music that our brains make music, but it's when we do anything at all that we might interpret what's going on in our brains as a special form of music, the music of thought or the music of the mind. So with any luck, that would not be the right one. One other demonstration involves perhaps the practical use of technology and theory, like the one that I've been describing. This came up in our discussion with Alexis as we got started on today's conversation. What if we can convert brain activity into sound, and possibly into musical sound, what difference would that make, or what possibly might we do with it? And here is an example, and this is also reveals another way in which brain activity can be rendered into sound. So this is not going to sound quite the same as the previous example, but there are many different ways to do the sonification, the conversion into music. A stethoscope is a sound instrument in which a trained user can discern a lot about the object, the heart, or whatever other part of the body, just by listening. So is it possible to take the idea of brain music and convert it into a diagnostic tool that works something like a stethoscope? So working from data from a previous study conducted by a student of mine and colleagues, we'll listen and learn what schizophrenia sounds like. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to attempt to teach you to discern the difference between schizophrenia patients and healthy control subjects just by listening. And then we'll take the schizophrenia quiz to see how you do with this. So each one of these clips is about 30 seconds long, so the entire schizophrenia experience lasts something like 8 minutes. And so, for example, here is the brain of a healthy subject. They happen to be performing a task that involves tones, but once again, it doesn't matter whether there's music coming in or there can be music coming out. This is what a healthy subject sounds like. Patient with schizophrenia. Training is now half over. Here's a healthy subject again. Quiz. We'll listen to 4 passages, and after each one I'll ask you to vote on whether you think it's a healthy subject or a patient. Here's example number 1. How many of you think that was a healthy subject? And how many of you think that was a patient? Okay, the answer to that is that was a healthy subject. I'm not sure whether the majority was with that or not. I couldn't actually tell from here. Okay, test number 2. Patient was indeed a patient. Number 3. Healthy subject, patient. That was another schizophrenia patient. Okay, and on to the last. Another healthy subject. So how many of you got 3 or more right? I'll just point out to you, very good, good job. I'll point out to you that you had no access to any background information about these 4 patients, no patient history, no diagnostic information, nothing anatomical, not even perhaps a deep understanding of what schizophrenia is like, and yet, after 30 seconds of training, you were able to make the diagnosis fairly accurately in all 4 cases. There's a difference there. It came to mind because we were talking about rhythm, but it's more than just that. There are other differences, some which we can analyze out as statistical differences, but some which may be more subtle than that. My take-home message is that if we look at the brain as a computer, we might think of it as having modules which are driven by output, driven by inputs, the immediate environment, running an inner computational language of some sort. The alternative, however, is that a lot is happening from inside. There's continuous interaction in the brain, and that what we're doing at all times is both improvising, composing or improvising, and listening to and inner music, or in short, you are music. That's the starting point for our conversation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. That's absolutely fascinating. I really feel that we ought to have this diagnostic test put in practice in our psychiatric hospitals. Now's the time for the audience to participate, to have questions, to have comments, to either or both of our 2 speakers. So who's going to start with a comment or a question? We've got roving we've got roving microphones, which are Lucy has over here. So if you'd like to, please feel brave. It's really very easy. Yes, we've got a hand over there. We're starting. Once we start, we're fine. Excellent.
Hello. When you say that that's music of the brain, how does the brain relate to the pitch we hear? Because it seems to me that the pitch we were hearing in both patients and healthy people were very similar, actually. Harmonically, they sound pretty similar.
So we have a question which I'd like to ask to both speakers. I'll start with Dan, which is the question of pitch. And I think, were you asking about whether the pitch indicates something in the brain? I think that's what you were indicating.
No, I wonder whether the pitch reflected accurately the brain.
Okay.
Or it was your own choice.
Right.
Yes. Pitch.
Okay, yes.
Thanks.
The question goes to the question of how do you sonify? What decisions do you make to take activity data of any sort and convert it into sound? In this case, I believe the pitches are partly indexed in that if a brain area is moving or oscillating slowly, it was assigned a lower pitch, but the scale was my choice. And so in that sense, the pitches themselves are not meaningful. That allows for us to focus on the rhythms, which do turn out to be meaningful. So in the other instance, the pitches were more determined, the vision piece, the pitches were more determined by the intrinsic oscillations of brain regions. But how to figure out what pitch to set an oscillating part of the brain is itself a question. What drives that? Pitch itself, by the way, though, as we listen to pitches, is quite explicitly represented in the brain when we do hear pitch. Hearing pitch and the pitch of the brain are sort of two different, though, ways of thinking about pitch.
Thanks. Alexis, would you like to comment on that, please?
All I was going to say is it's an interesting issue. Pitch. We lost the go. It's an interesting issue, pitch, but in the sense of what's me?
That's where you're standing. Move slightly forward.
Okay, it's an interesting issue, pitch, he says for the third time, which is because looking at it from the perspective that I was talking about, kind of looking at this spiking in the brain. Although in the computations that I look at, each of these spikes, these musical spikes, has a height which relates to its pitch. In the actual brain itself, I don't know if there's any data about whether pitch height. I don't think pitch height, but spike height is generally considered. I'd be interested if there's anyone in the audience. I think we've got a few experts here who know anything about whether spike height is relevant, because my impression is the current research in the brain is very much focused on the rhythms and the timing. So I don't know if there's anyone in the audience. Is that appropriate?
What do you mean by spike height?
Generally, when you're looking at, if you look at the computational protocol that I was talking about, what you have is you have a series of notes, and the speed of the notes represents something in the processing. But in my protocol, the height represents something as well. It represents the pitch. Now, my understanding is in the brain, there's not really been much done looking at whether spike heights are of relevance. Is it
Spikes are sort of quite stereotyped, though, so actually that's why they've been ignored, because they're always the same generally. Actually, it is the timing, and it's the summation of spikes as we call it, and the relative timing of them. But the actual height of the spike itself, I don't think would be that relevant, because it's quite stereotyped.
Yeah, so that's really the issue of pitch is something that I've imposed on my model, or something that is imposed on the mapping. You know, when you display what's there's no kind of inherent pitch element in the spiking.
Thank you. Have we got another question? Another question or comment? So yes, we have one at the back, please.
I was interested in the use of the sound files as a means of diagnosing schizophrenia. And I was wondering, has that been carried out as a double-blind trial, so that there's some ability to verify what we're presented there was some clear-cut cases, I think, of clearly people that we were told were schizophrenic in a certain sort of sound form, and then other people we were told were healthy patients. But has that been carried out as a double-blinded trial, so that the people are listening to the data and have no way of making inferences?
Okay, again for Dan, can you answer this? Basically, I think the question is, we've just seen a few cases, but has this been verified over many cases? Has it been done where the observer is entirely blind and so on?
No, all I can say is that in audiences, this is the usual outcome. So it's a demonstration. I will say, though, that the test cases were randomly chosen from a set of subjects. So I didn't pick those in order to be clear cases. They were just 4 chosen at random and randomly ordered. So it would be so easy to do exactly what you've described, and it's on my to-do list.
Good, thank you. We have a question at the front now, please.
I'm quite close, so shall I just say?
Thank you. I wondered if you've done this with any other mental illnesses, or can you see the sort of differences in, say, someone with depression or other?
Yes, depression would be a great diagnostic help to be able to use techniques like this. My situation is that I teach at a liberal arts college, and so I rely on other people for data. And so I was able to get the schizophrenia data to work with that. There's more and more data archived. I don't know that there are publicly archived depression studies. What is archived is ADHD. It's of great interest with kids to be studying this, and there's archived data there. And in work I've been doing with students, there does seem to be frequency differences in ADHD. What I have not done yet is what I did with you all today, which is to make sound files to see if people can tell them apart. Informally, it seems that at least musicians with certain ways of representing this data can hear ADHD. But to be useful, of course, it has to be something that's really quite apparent. But I think ADHD has frequency components which are different. I think that I would go that far in generalizing. And in any case, I think that's a great idea, and there'd be other ways to apply this.
Can we just follow that up?
Absolutely.
It would also be really interesting to sort of measure the differences when you perhaps use something like music therapy.
Yes, that's a great idea.
You can change the tone of the brain.
That's a great idea, and I believe actually that is an ongoing research here, is to talk about how mood can be altered. A mood can both be measured using physiological signals, and then how musical tones can be adjusted to match those physiological measures, and then used in a sense to self-adjust one's own emotional state, which I think is a fascinating research project which is based right here.
Thank you very much for that comment. That was fascinating. With lots of research, and this is obviously opening up a completely new field, so that's fascinating. Thank you. Many more diseases to investigate, not only depression and ADHD, but I guess anxiety and borderline personality. You go through the list, and it's there for investigation. Fascinating. Okay, anyone has another question, comment? Yes, we've one at the back.
So I was also interested in learning from Alexis a bit more about why he feels that music is a useful way of passing information through computer systems. I was trying to work out what the basis of a major scale would be in terms of informational content. I'm not particularly good at maths, but I think it might be a minor triad. So you're going to have possibly from a 128-note MIDI keyboard, 3 notes, so that would be 128 cubed, which I think is actually a 24-bit system. And so if we're thinking about the processing now as a 64-bit system, I'm not quite sure. I'm so interested to work out what would the actual value of a computer system of music be in terms of that processing.
That's for you, Alexis, so perhaps you could address that.
Okay, the traditional approach that we've had, with developing technical systems has been, we design them as efficiently as possible in terms of their processing, and then we worry about how the hell are we going to get information out of these things, how are we going to diagnose them when there's problems. It's a secondary issue. What I was trying to do with this musical processing approach is kind of balance up the transparency with the processing ability. So in other words, it's less efficient to process with music, it's very true. However, when you're actually processing emotions, what happens is that the processing parts contain the actual emotions that you're processing in a way that is understandable to a human being. So embedded in the design of this computation protocol is its own expression. Whereas your average computer has evolved over many decades to be as efficient and fast as possible, and no one gives a damn that half the world, 99% of the world, can't understand what's going on, and you need all of these probes to work out what's going on. So that's really, that's where I'm coming from, is it's kind of a meeting point between human-computer interaction and processing. What you were talking about there, I am specifically talking about emotional processing. So the way that the emotions are represented is the pulse rate is what's called the arousal state of the machine, and the key mode defines how positive or negative the machine is feeling. So those are the information elements, the key information elements that are carried. It's not like bits where you encode a number between 0 and 255.
If I can just follow up on that, one of the great things about music is how expert really all listeners are. Everyone can detect a chord that is in tune, a chord that's out of tune. Everyone is fluent in a musical idiom, even if you're not theoretically trained in that idiom. What music allows you to do is to hear a lot of things at once, and that is a great, and information in this world is multidimensional and parallel, simultaneously parallel. And so I think the idea of using musical cues as ways of monitoring and detecting subtle changes in complex systems makes a great deal of intuitive sense, that there's opportunity there for all of our world to be communicating to us more effectively than with flashing lights and little beeps. They could be more informative.
Good. Have we got one more question? Yes, we have a question of the lady at the front here. Or the middle, I should say.
Can you hear me? Am I right?
Yes, we're fine. We're fine.
I think I'm particularly musically sensitive because when there was a loud bang or noise, I jump. And I do this wherever I am. If it's I'm going to a concert or whatever it is, people around me laugh because I jump. And I think I'm especially sensitive. Is that so?
We're going to have both our speakers. Alexis first, could you respond, and then Dan, all right? A very good question. Thank you very much indeed.
I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that. You were the only person in the audience to jump when I went like that. So on that sample of the audience, I would say yes, you are. You are. How that relates. I mean, music is. There are various theories about how music evolved and why it's evolved and why we respond to music in the way we do. I think what is clear is sound is a vital tool in our ability to survive. And generally, when a very loud sound happens nearby, it tends to not be a good thing. Sometimes it's a good thing, but it's often can be quite a bad thing. So we have these instinctive reactions, and perhaps your instinctive reactions are just a little more efficient than other people's.
Yeah. Your comment reminds me of a fascinating book on music by David Huron. It's called Sweet Anticipation. And his view of music is that it's always about surprise, that music is constantly surprising us, and that the whole process of hearing music is to be surprised and then to appraise the surprise after as having been a good surprise. But surprise is always a little bit of a startle, and whether it's a surprising move in a symphony or whether it's a sudden noise, we jump just a little. So it is, I think, on a continuum with musical emotion to jump at sound and then to jump at musical sound in a certain way. I mean, it seems like it's part of being human.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question. Have we got one more question? One more question?
Can I ask something?
Yes, of course you can, Lucy.
So I'm always really interested in the way that we try and describe the brain or how it works, and there's often we tend to sort of describe it using current technology. For example, Victorian era would be using pneumatic systems. It's this big sort of pneumatic system, and the computer's been a recent thing, now networks. And obviously you're describing it as an orchestra, which is interesting actually, because that isn't really related to current technology. But I just wondered if you could maybe comment on why we keep wanting to describe the brain using these sort of technologies.
Well, again, for both speakers, we'll start with Dan and finish with Alexis. Could you explain why we need to describe the brain?
So we're dealing with a fantastically complex system. The number of neurons exceeds the number of stars in the galaxy, and each one is connected to more than 1,000 others. So there are trillions of possible connections here. How are you going to begin to get a handle on that? And so people usually reach out to the most complicated thing they can find, whatever that is, and say, okay, it's sort of like this. And you're absolutely right, historically it moves from one thing to another. Are those choices of metaphors the right metaphors? And I think that the historical vote is usually no. I mean, it turns out that you get past the pneumatics and plumbing metaphor, and it looks a little archaic and a little quaint. And I think that if you push a little bit on the computer metaphor, it's highlighting parts of us that don't quite capture it. The computer metaphor doesn't get the simultaneity of experience. It doesn't get the interrelatedness of all the parts of experience. It certainly doesn't get the temporality, the awareness that we carry with us at all times of what just happened. Computers have a really hard time with all of that stuff. But that's crucial to consciousness, I think, and that pushes us towards new metaphors.
Would you like to comment on the metaphors we have for describing the brain, the pneumatic, the computer, the orchestra, or whatever?
The only thing I'd say is that it should be no surprise that we are limited by these metaphors. I think we like to think of our brains as being far more a blank canvas than they actually are. You know, from birth, we're being pumped full of a kind of models of the world, and the world as we think we see it really is a shared consciousness, a model that we've developed from birth. So the fact that we happen to live in an age where so many people think of the brain in computational terms, and the fact that in the STEAM age people thought of these things in different terms, it should be no surprise. And truth be told, we may be living in, we may be living in an age where we think of the brain in terms of rhythms and interacting rhythms. We may turn out to be mistaken, but is it really a mistake? Because maybe you're just getting a close from. Are you getting more accurate, or are you in fact just seeing things from a new perspective? Every perspective has its value. Who can argue that the lens of computers as such has changed the world? That way of thinking about the processing of information, thinking in terms of CPUs, memories, and so forth, it's changed the world, and it's done a lot of great things. So these perspectives, do they limit us or do they give us more power? I certainly think the perspective as the brain, as music, is going to be a very powerful thing over the next couple of decades.
Well, thank you very much. And of course I entirely agree. There's a principle of complementarity that we perhaps can't describe the world in just one way, and that there are multiple forms of description of the world. Some of them are incompatible with each other, but in order to fully describe the world, we must have these different forms of description. Now, before I thank our two speakers for this evening, we have one more announcement, and that concerns Saturday midday, when one of you will have the opportunity to be wired up, and I'm going to ask Alexis to describe what this opportunity is all about.
So the two performances that Simon Eibel mentioned on Saturday, there's the collaboration between Eduardo Miranda and Dan in the evening, which is the Symphony of Minds Listening. During the day, there's a film that I've written and directed, which I actually filmed 4 films, and we're going to plug 4 audience members into bio-monitoring equipment, and the direction that the film takes on Saturday afternoon will depend on how those 4 people are feeling as they experience the movie. One of those, there's a lot of people who basically want to be plugged in, and what we decided to do is reserve one of them for somebody here in the audience tonight. And we're going to use a democratic method. You're basically going to put your name in a hat. So if you'd like the chance to be one of the people who's going to be subconsciously directing the plot of this movie as it shows on the screen in the Jill Craigie over there, please scribble your name and email on a piece of paper, and Lucy at the back there will arrange some form of receptacle into which you can place it.
Have you got bits of paper there, Lucy? Yeah, the bit of paper, so you just need to write your name on a bit of paper as you go on if you want to take part. Well, it's been a fascinating evening. Thank you for coming all the way over from America, Dan. That's much appreciated. I think we have a completely new perspective on music, not just recreation, it's clearly something else as well. What it is, where it's going, well, I think that is very much for the future to tell. But we've certainly got glimpses of that possible future from both our speakers. So, Dan and Alexis, thank you very much. And thank you for your